Imagine inventing the future. Then imagine watching that future slowly destroy your company. That sounds almost impossible, but that is basically what happened to Kodak. And Kodak wasn't some small company that got caught sleeping. For most of the 20th century, Kodak was photography. Birthdays, weddings, vacations, graduations. That embarrassing family photo that your mom still has framed for some reason. If somebody took a picture, there was a pretty good chance Kodak made money somewhere along the way. And that detail matters, because Kodak's real business was never simply selling cameras. The camera was just how they got you into the system. The real money came after you pressed the button. And once you understand that, this entire story starts looking very different. The story really begins in 1888 with a man named George Eastman. At the time, photography was not exactly something you casually did on the weekend. Cameras were bulky, glass plates had to be prepared, chemicals had to be handled, and taking a photograph,
You gotta be a real nerd about it.
basically getting a picture of your family involved slightly more preparation than launching a small science experiment. Eastman wanted to make all of that disappear, so Kodak introduced a camera with one ridiculously simple promise. You press the button, we do the rest. And they really meant it. You bought the camera, you took your pictures, then you sent the entire camera back to Kodak. Kodak developed the film, made the prints, reloaded the camera, and sent it back to you. Very convenient for the customer. Even more convenient for Kodak, because this created one of the best recurring revenue systems in consumer history. The camera got you in, film kept you paying, developing kept you paying, printing kept you paying. Every time you took more pictures, Kodak made more money, and that loop became enormous. Over the decades, Kodak built factories, processing labs, chemistry expertise, retail distribution, and one of the most recognizable brands in the world. The yellow box was everywhere, and the really beautiful thing about Kodak's business was that innovation usually helped them. Better cameras meant people took more pictures. More pictures meant more film, more developing, and more prints. So for decades, Kodak had the dream setup. Make photography better, and Kodak gets richer.
But there was just one tiny problem.
Eventually, somebody made photography better in a way that removed Kodak from the transaction. And unfortunately for Kodak, that somebody worked for Kodak. In 1975, a young Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson was given an unusual assignment. His job was to experiment with a relatively new electronic component called a CCD, basically a sensor that could capture light electronically. And Sasson started wondering, could you build a camera that didn't need film at all? So he started assembling one from whatever parts he could find, and the result was not exactly elegant. The thing weighed about 8 pounds. It used the lens from a Super 8 movie camera, 16 nickel-cadmium batteries, and a black and white sensor that captured an image just 100 pixels by 100 pixels. That's around 0.01 megapixels. Your microwave display probably has more detail. And there was no memory card. The image was recorded onto a cassette tape. Taking the picture itself was quick. Saving it, 23 seconds. Then you had to remove the cassette, put it into a separate playback machine, and finally display the image on a television. So yes, very portable, very convenient, absolutely ready to destroy the consumer camera market. Obviously not. By today's standards, it was terrible. But by 1975 standards, it was astonishing. Because something had just happened for the first time. A photograph had been captured without film. Think about what that meant. Inside a company making billions from physical photography, one of its own engineers had just built a machine suggesting that physical photography might eventually become unnecessary. Kodak's future competitor wasn't hiding in another company. Shh. It was sitting inside Kodak's own laboratory. Now this is usually where people tell the simplified version of the story. Kodak invents the digital camera. Management panics. Some executive screams, "Hide it!" They bury the invention in a basement. Then 20 years later, everyone acts surprised when digital photography takes over. Great story! Not really what happened. Because that first digital camera was genuinely awful as a consumer product. There were no cheap memory cards, laptops weren't sitting in everyone's house, high-resolution screens were rare, broadband didn't exist, and Instagram was still several decades away from making everyone photograph their lunch. Imagine trying to sell that 8-pound box to a normal family in 1975. Good news! You no longer need film. What?
That's great, right?
The photo is black and white, extremely tiny, takes 23 seconds to save, and you'll need another machine to view it. Yeah, I think I'll keep the regular film camera. And Kodak knew this. They patented the technology. They kept researching digital imaging. They weren't blind.
And that's actually what makes the story much more interesting.
Kodak could see digital coming. The problem was that seeing the future and reorganizing your entire company around it,
Oh, they're two different things.
because every time digital photography improved, Kodak faced a brutal contradiction. The technology looked better, while Kodak's existing business looked worse.
Let's take a second and put yourself in management's position.
Your film business is enormous. The factories are built, stores already carry the product, customers understand it, margins are attractive, and thousands of careers depend on keeping that machine alive. Then someone walks into the room with a technology that could eventually make film unnecessary.
Oh boy, what exactly are you supposed to do?
Immediately destroy the business that's making you rich for a market that barely exists? Easy decision from the future. Not quite as easy when you're sitting inside Kodak.
Oh, that's the trap.
Years later, a Harvard Business School professor named Clayton Christensen would become famous for explaining exactly this kind of problem. He called it disruptive innovation.
And the idea is almost unfair.
The companies most vulnerable to disruption are often not badly run companies. They're usually doing what successful companies are supposed to do. They're listening to their biggest customers, protecting margins, investing in profitable products, and ignoring tiny markets that don't look important yet. Sounds responsible.
But that's the problem.
Because disruptive technologies often start out worse. Lower quality, smaller market, lower margins. Sometimes they barely look like competition at all. So the rational decision is, we'll deal with that later. And then later, the terrible little technology gets better. The market grows, customers change, and suddenly the thing you ignored because it wasn't good enough is eating your business. Kodak was almost a perfect example. Early digital photography was worse than film in nearly every way normal customers cared about. Sensors were expensive, images looked bad, storage was limited, and printing them was awkward. So staying focused on film didn't look stupid.
Well, for years, it looked like the correct business decision.
And that's what makes disruption so dangerous. By the time the wrong decision becomes obvious, you may have spent years being rewarded for making it.
And again, Kodak wasn't doing nothing. They studied electronic photography. They developed digital imaging technology throughout the 1980s and 1990s. In 1986, Kodak announced a practical megapixel CCD image sensor. Later, they worked on professional digital camera systems and eventually sold consumer digital cameras too. So the company did not simply ignore digital. Something stranger happened. Kodak tried to enter the digital world without giving up the economics of the film world. And that distinction changes everything.
Think about Kodak's old machine. Every photograph potentially created more revenue, more film, more development, more printing. Now compare that with digital photography. Once you own the camera and storage, taking another picture basically costs nothing. 10 pictures? Fine. 100? Why not? 1,000 terrible pictures of your dog sleeping? Go for it. Delete 997 of them. No extra roll of film, no developing, and increasingly, no print either. The very behavior that made photography explode was destroying Kodak's profit engine. That's a nasty trade. Kodak did try to preserve the printing side. They invested in digital kiosks and home photo printers. And from Kodak's perspective, this made perfect sense.
Okay, fine.
Pictures are digital now, but surely people will still want to print them. Except people were changing faster than Kodak's assumptions. A photograph could live on your computer, then a website, then a phone, then a social network. The picture itself was becoming information, and Kodak had spent more than a century becoming unbelievably good at chemistry.
That's not a minor adjustment.
That's like spending 100 years perfecting the horse, then somebody rolls up in a car and says, "Yeah, we're not doing horses anymore." Kodak still knew cameras, they understood images and consumers, and they had scientists, patents, and a massive brand. But digital photography completely rearranged where the value lived. Suddenly, you didn't win because you were the best at film chemistry.
You needed electronics, sensors, storage, screens, software, and a bunch of more stuff.
Companies like Sony, Canon, and Nikon were much more comfortable on that battlefield. Kodak was trying to learn a new game while defending the old game that still paid the bills. And unfortunately for Kodak, digital cameras weren't even the final disruption. Because while camera companies were fighting over digital cameras, the camera itself was about to disappear into the phone. The first camera phones looked terrible, and serious photographers could quite reasonably laugh at them. Tiny sensor, bad lens, awful picture.
Well, basically a toy.
Which should sound familiar by now. New disruptive technology often has this annoying habit of looking useless right before it becomes good enough. And once a camera was sitting in everyone's pocket, convenience started beating technical perfection. Before smartphones, you brought a camera because you planned to take pictures. After smartphones, you took pictures because
the camera is already there.
And then social media changed the reason we took pictures too. You weren't only preserving memories anymore. A photo could be a message, a joke, proof that something happened, advertising, identity, entertainment, basically a new form of communication.
And the center of photography kept moving. Film, digital cameras, phones, software, platforms. Kodak participated in pieces of that transition, but it never built another economic machine anywhere near as powerful as film. And that is the part of this story that really matters. Kodak's failure wasn't simply a failure to invent, it was a failure to replace. They had to replace one of the greatest businesses in consumer history before the market forced them to. And that is psychologically brutal. Now, think about what's inside the company like that.
The spreadsheet tells you the current business is profitable. The manager running it says demand is still strong. Investors want margins. Employees have spent 20 years becoming experts at something. Factories already exist. Customers are already paying. Meanwhile, the future walks into the room with a worse product and basically says, "Trust me." Which one wins the meeting? Exactly. The old business has numbers, the future has assumptions. That's how successful companies become prisoners of their own success. Kodak's film empire had shaped its factories, talent, culture, budgets, distribution, and even the company's identity. They had optimized themselves beautifully for the world Kodak helped create. Then the world changed, and optimization became rigidity. By the 2000s, none of this was theoretical anymore. Film demand collapsed. Competition in digital cameras became brutal. Then smartphones started attacking standalone cameras themselves. Kodak restructured, sold assets, cut costs, and tried to find new businesses. But the old machine was disappearing faster than the new one could replace it. And in January 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Think about the irony of that. The company that helped millions of people preserve the 20th century couldn't preserve its own 20th century business model. That's almost too perfect. And you'd think that's where the story ends. It doesn't.
Kodak survived!
The company emerged from bankruptcy in 2013, but it came out much smaller and fundamentally different, focusing increasingly on commercial printing and imaging technology rather than the consumer photography empire most people remembered. The yellow Kodak name survived. The business underneath it didn't. So what actually killed Kodak? Not one idiot executive, not one missed meeting, not one engineer being ignored, not even one invention. Kodak's real problem was nastier than that. The future gave customers more of what they wanted, while requiring less of what made Kodak rich. That's a much harder problem than simply failing to notice new technology. Steve Sasson's digital camera was not ready to conquer the world in 1975. Kodak wasn't stupid for refusing to immediately replace film with that exact machine. The failure happened over the decades afterward. Digital kept improving, storage got cheaper, screens got better, the economics changed, customer behavior changed, and the evidence kept piling up. Kodak never built a new engine fast enough before the old one finally stopped working.
And that's why this story matters beyond photography. Whenever a company becomes dominant, its greatest advantage can quietly become its greatest constraint. The processes become efficient, the margins become predictable. Everyone learns what a good decision looks like. Then the environment changes, and suddenly, the decision that looks terrible for today's business might be the only decision that gives you a business tomorrow. That's why disruption always looks obvious afterward. From the future, the answer is simple. Obviously, Kodak should have gone digital. Sure, but from inside Kodak, every step toward that future looked a little bit like voluntarily destroying something that was still making enormous amounts of money. And that brings us back to where we started. Imagine inventing the future. Kodak did. The tragedy wasn't that they couldn't see what was coming. They could. They helped create it. They watched it improve. They knew where photography was heading. And still, they couldn't transform themselves fast enough to survive the world they helped invent.